So welcome to my series of videos on applied macroeconomics. And in this video is going to be in two parts. The first part will be talking about international trade theories, and it will give a mathematical interpretation of international trade theories. And the second part also talks about why countries must engage in international trade. So other reasons why countries must engage in international trade apart from the international trade theories. Now, basically, in the past, countries used to trade with each other, okay? So basically in the past or historically, countries used to trade with each other so that goods that are produced in, let's say, country A, if country B does not have much ability to produce that good, the good will be produced in country A and exported to country B, all right? And on the other hand, country B may also have abilities in the production of a certain good that country A will not have the ability in to do that. So in that simple sense, country B is going to produce that good and also export it to country A. So in a case where the two countries do not want to pay money to each other, the two countries will produce the goods that they have their respective abilities in and export to each other in a form of barter trade. Now, in today's trade environment, this idea will be an oversimplification because nowadays, in current times, there are a lot of trade transactions that goes on. Countries will trade with a country like country A, for instance, may trade with several other countries, not only one country, all right? However, notwithstanding, this international trade idea helps us to understand that countries must produce goods that they are efficient in producing, all right? So the international trade theory here, or the international trade argument, is a simplification of reality. However, it helps us to understand that countries must produce goods that they are efficient in, and it also helps us to understand the benefits of international trade. Now, in that sense, there are two basic theories that explains why countries must embark on international trade, okay? One of the theory or one of the laws is the theory or the law of absolute advantage. The theory or the law of absolute advantage. Then we have the theory or the law of comparative advantage. Comparative advantage. Now let's begin our discussion with the law of absolute advantage. Now, when we talk about absolute advantage, it is the ability of an individual, company, region, or country to produce a greater quantity of a good or service with the same quantity of inputs per unit of time, all right? So for instance, what we are saying here is that if country A has absolute advantage in producing a particular good as compared to country B, that means that for that particular good, country A produces a greater quantity of it, even though assuming that country A and country B are using the same level of resource, country A will produce a greater quantity of that good. That means that country A has an absolute advantage in the production of that good. On the other hand, if country A and country B produce the same quantity of that good, but let's say country A uses lesser resources to do that, okay? It also means that country A has absolute advantage in that good, all right? So here, absolute advantage can manifest in two ways. Whether we are using the same resources, but I'm producing more in that good than you, that means I have absolute advantage than you, or we are producing the same. So the first one is that we are using the same level of resource, but I'm producing higher than you. That means I have absolute advantage as compared to you. On the other hand, we are producing the same quantity, but I am using a lesser resource. That also means that I have a higher absolute advantage as compared to you. So then what is the law of absolute advantage? The law of absolute advantage simply says that countries should specialize in producing the good that they have absolute advantage in. Let me take it again. The law of absolute advantage therefore explains that, or the law states that countries should produce the goods that they have absolute advantage in. Okay. Now, let's go to the law of the law of comparative advantage. Now, the law of comparative advantage demonstrates that international trade is potentially beneficial to the economic welfare of countries if countries specialize in the production of those goods in which it has comparative advantage or greatest relative efficiency. Greatest relative efficiency. Now let's go back to the law of absolute advantage. The fact that I am having absolute advantage in a certain good does not mean that if I compare or relatively, I have more efficiency in it. It doesn't mean that. So the fact that I have absolute advantage in a certain good, let's say we have two goods, good A, good B, and we have two countries, country A, country B. The fact that country A is probably having absolute advantage in producing good A and good B doesn't mean that relatively it will have advantage in producing good A and good B. All right. So here, this concept may not seem understandable, but it will become quite clearer when we illustrate it with a simplified numerical example. All right. So let's look at this example. Now, in this illustration, the question says that the US can produce 20 planes and 2 cruise ships. 20 planes and 2 cruise ships. And France can produce 12 planes and 2 cruise ships. The A says that what is the total pre-trade world output for both commodities? All right, so here we are just going to illustrate it in a simple diagram. All right, remember, US can produce 20 planes and 2 cruise ships with the resources they have. And France can produce 12 planes and 2 cruise ships with the resources they have. So here, we want to illustrate it in a table. So we have this table. Okay, so the question says that we have two countries. We have USA, and then we have France, okay? And then they produce aeroplanes, and then they produce cruise ships, all right? So the question says that using their resources, US can produce 20 aeroplanes and 2 cruise ships. And for France, they can produce 12 aeroplanes and then 2 cruise ships. All right, so it means that the total world output will be 40. If you add this, we have 32 aeroplanes and 4 cruise ships. All right, so the total world output is that. Assuming we have only these 2 countries in the world, assuming we have only these 2 countries in the world, the total world output will be that there will be production of 32 aeroplanes and 4 cruise ships. So the total world output is that there will be 32 aeroplanes and then 4 cruise ships. Now, the question goes on to say that what is the opportunity cost of producing one of each product by each country? All right, so to understand this B perfectly, we are just going to do ratio and proportion analysis. All right, so remember, for USA, the ratio of plane to cruise ships is 20:2. So mathematically, ratios, we can simplify this ratio. So it will be 10:1. That is when we divide both sides by 2, we will have 10:1. All right. When we divide both sides by 2, we are going to have 10:1. Now, what does this mean? This means that, so remember, it will be 1 cruise ship is to 10 aeroplanes. So this means that every time USA produces 1 more cruise ships, they sacrifice 1 aeroplane. Sorry, 10 aeroplanes. So 10 planes. All right. Yeah, because it is 1 cruise ship is to 10 aeroplanes. Okay. Now, if you want to know how many cruise ships is to 1 aeroplane, okay, if less, more divide. It's just simple. If 10:1, that means 1 will be 1/10. All right. If 10:1, okay, if 1 cruise ship is to 10 aeroplanes, that means that 1 aeroplane must be far less than 10 cruise ships. All right. So if less, more divide. Okay. So here, this also means that every time USA produces 1 more aeroplane or 1 more plane, sorry, 1 more plane, they sacrifice 1/10 of cruise ships. All right. So let's look at that for France. Let's look at that for France. So France is 12:2. So let's look at that for France. So France is 12:2. So for France, the plane and cruise ship is 12:2. And remember, ratio of proportion, we can simplify this by dividing both sides by 2. So we are going to have 6:1. All right. So here, what it means is that every time France produces 1 more cruise ship, they sacrifice 6 planes. All right. So because 1:6, that means that if you want to know the number of planes, I mean 1 plane is to how many cruise ships, if less, more divide. So it will be 1, that one will be 1/6. So this also means that every time France produces 1 plane, they sacrifice 1/6 cruise ships. They sacrifice 1/6 cruise ships. All right, that is what they are going to do. They are going to sacrifice 1/6 cruise ships because 1 cruise ship is to 6 planes. That means that 1 plane will be 1/6 cruise ships. All right, the inverse. Okay, so the next question says that determine the commodity that gives each country a comparative advantage. All right. Now we are saying that comparative advantage, remember the definition is that it is the commodity that you produce that you use lesser resources as compared to your other neighbor or to the other country or to the other trade partner. So you have comparative advantage when you're able to produce that commodity with relatively lesser opportunity cost of resources. All right. You have comparative advantage if you are going to produce that commodity with relatively lesser opportunity cost of resources. So let's go back to our question. Sorry, let's go back to our solution here. So let's see. Here, we are going to compare the cost of producing plane the cost of producing cruise ship in US as compared to the cost of producing cruise ship in France. So let's look at something. Whenever US produces one more cruise ship, they sacrifice 10 planes, okay? Anytime France produces one cruise ship, they sacrifice 6 planes. So here, comparatively, it will cost France less to produce one cruise ship, because when France produces one cruise ship, the opportunity cost they incur is that they sacrifice 6 planes, okay? But when US produces one cruise ship, the opportunity cost is that they sacrifice 10 planes. That is too much, okay? So here, France has a comparative advantage in producing cruise ships. Okay, now let's look at that for the plane. Now here, if US produces one plane, they sacrifice 1/10 of cruise ships. That is 0.1 of cruise ships. But when France produces one plane, they sacrifice 1/6 of cruise ships. All right, 1/6 is greater than 1/10. If you can punch your calculator, 1/6 is greater than 1/10. So here it means that it costs US relatively less opportunity cost to produce one plane as compared to France. Because if US produces one plane, they sacrifice 1/10 of cruise ships. But if France produces one plane, they sacrifice more, like 1/6. 1/6 is greater than 1/10. So 1/6 of cruise ships. So here, what it means is that USA has a comparative advantage in producing planes, all right? In producing planes. So that is C. That is what the question is looking for in point C. Then, going back to the question, it says determine the pattern of trade after specialization. Determine the pattern of trade after specialization, all right? Now remember that France is specializing in cruise ships and US is specializing in aeroplanes. So if all of them specialize, this is what is going to happen. If there is specialization, this is what is going to happen. So we have USA and we have France. And we have planes and we have cruise ships. All right. So here, remember that when it comes to US is 10 planes is to one cruise ship. All right, US. And then for France is 6 planes is to one cruise ships. Okay. So let's look at something very interesting here. If they are specializing, it means that US, these 2 cruise ships here will flow over and become planes. Listen carefully. For US, these 2 cruise ships here will flow over and become planes, all right? But remember, every cruise ship is equivalent to, one cruise ship is equivalent to what? 10 planes. So if this 2 cruise ship is flowing over to become planes, if 1 is to 10, that means that these 2 will be what? 20. All right, these 2 will be 20. These 2 will be 20. So if they specialize, the 2 cruise ships will flow over here. So it will be 0 here. When it flows over, it becomes 20. And we already have 20 planes. So 20 plus 20, you have 40 planes. All right. So they will produce no cruise ships because they don't have any specialization in it. So that is the situation. On the other hand, France will specialize in cruise ships. But for France, we have 6 aeroplanes is to one cruise ship, all right? So here, if there's 12 aeroplanes here is flowing over to become cruise ships, every 6 planes will give you 1 cruise ship. So 12 planes is just going to give you 2 cruise ships. 12 planes is just going to give you 2 cruise ships. So when this 12 flows over and comes here, it will become 2. But then we already have 2 existing. So 2 plus 2 become 4. And of course, they produce no planes. So the total world output will now become 40 planes and 4 cruise ships. 40 planes and 4 cruise ships. All right, and of course, we can clearly see that specialization is better. Okay, we can clearly see that the specialization is better because here it was 32 and 4, but after specialization, it becomes 40 and 4. So the specialization is better. All right. Now the question goes on to say that what will be the acceptable term of trade for each country? So here the idea is that if each country is going to exchange, what will be the acceptable term of trade? All right. So this is very tricky. So we need to pay attention here. What will be the acceptable term of trade for each country? What will be the acceptable term of trade for each country? Now let's look at something very interesting. Remember these ratios here. Remember this. All right. So if you want to look at the acceptable term of trade, remember that US is producing aeroplanes as their specialization. Okay. France is producing cruise ships as their specialization. All right. Now remember that if France produces 1 cruise ships, they lose 6 aeroplanes. If France produces 1 cruise ship, they lose 6 aeroplanes. All right. Now this means that France will be willing to exchange 1 cruise ships when they can get more than 6 aeroplanes. Because if I'm France and I produce 1 cruise ships, I lose 6 aeroplanes. So it means that if I'm going to give 1 cruise ship to US, I want profit, I want to gain. So I'll require that US will give me more than 6 cruise ships. Sorry, than 6 aeroplanes. Because if I produce 1 cruise ships, I lose 6 aeroplanes. So if I'm going to give US 1 cruise ships, because I am rational and I want to gain, I would want more than 6 aeroplanes. All right. I want more than 6 airplanes. So the number of airplanes should be more than 6. Or 6 should be less than the number of airplanes. Or the number of airplanes should be more than 6. Right? Now let's go to US. Now for US, every cruise ship costs them what? 10 airplanes. Every cruise ships. Okay, for US, every cruise ship costs them 10 airplanes. So US will be willing to exchange less than 10 aeroplanes for 1 cruise ship. Because if I produce the cruise ship myself, if I'm US and I produce the cruise ship myself, I'll lose 10 aeroplanes. So why should I exchange more than 10 aeroplanes for 1 cruise ship in terms of France? I will not do that. So US will also be willing to exchange less than 10 aeroplanes for 1 cruise ship. All right, less than 10 aeroplanes for 1 cruise ship. So for US, the number of planes they'll be willing to exchange should be less than 10. All right. So in essence, the number of planes that the two of them will agree on, that figure should be more than 6 for France, but it should be less than 10 for US. So the figure should be between 6 and 10. Now, when we move from 6 to 7, okay, when we move from 6 to 7, France benefits but US loses because France is requiring more than 6. Again, for US, when we move from 10 down to 9, the US will benefit because US is looking for less than 10. So US will benefit but France loses. All right. So France will negotiate for a better deal again. So France will now move to 8 and US will also move down to 8. So it seems that 8 is where the two of them will attain equilibrium. 8 is where the two of them will attain equilibrium. So the acceptable term of trade between the two parties is 1 cruise ships for 10 planes. Sorry, for 8 planes. 1 cruise ships for 8 planes. All right, so that will be the acceptable terms of trade between them. That will be the acceptable terms of trade between them. All right. Okay. So finally, the question says that suppose after specialization, US wishes to get 3 cruise ships. What will be the total world output for both commodities? Remember that the acceptable terms of trade is what? 8 planes is to 1 cruise ship. Okay. So if US wishes to get 3 cruise ships, that means they will sacrifice 24 planes. All right. So it says, suppose after specialization, US wishes to get 3 cruise ships. What will be the total world output? So what this means is that if US wishes to get 3 cruise ships, they must be willing to sacrifice 24 aeroplanes. All right. So this is the after specialization. That means that in the question, this is D, that is D, right? In the question, that is D. So D is after, so and this is the E, acceptable terms of trade. Now the question says that if US wishes to get 3 cruise ships, okay, if they wish to get 3 cruise ships, how many or what will be the pattern of trade afterwards? So I'm going to draw it here. So we have planes and we have cruise ships. And we have USA here, and we have France here. Now, this is the after specialization, right? And US wants 3 cruise ships. So let's say they'll get their 3 cruise ships. But based on the terms of trade, it means they will sacrifice 24 aeroplanes because the acceptable terms of trade between these two countries is that 1 cruise ship is for 8 planes. So if they want 3 cruise ships, they will sacrifice 3 times 8, that is 24. All right, that is 24. So here, 24 will leave here. When it flows over to cruise ships, it now becomes 3. So what is left here is 40 minus 24, and that is 16. Okay, and that will be 16. All right. Then for France, they will lose 3 cruise ships, so remaining of 1, but they will gain additional 24 planes. All right, so the total here will still be 40 and 4, but just that there have been a redistribution because they have traded. All right, so this is the F, and let's look at the second example. All right, so in this second example, we are going to look at this similar situation, but with different figures. Now, the question says that Korea can produce 50 cars and 25 motorcycles. Of course, the assumption is that with all the resources they have. Then Germany can produce 100 cars and 25 motorcycles. A, what is the total pre-trade world output for both commodities? All right, so this is pretty simple. We are going to draw our table. So we have, I think the question is on cars and motorcycles. So we have cars and motorcycles. Then we have Korea. Then we have Germany. Then we have the total world output here. So we are going to draw this. Okay. So the question says that Korea can produce 50 cars and 25 motorcycles, and US can produce 100 cars and 25 motorcycles. So in total, we have 150 here, and we have 50 here. All right, 150 and 50. Now the question says that what is the opportunity cost of producing one of each product by each country? Okay, so here with the first example, because you have an idea, I'm just going to rush over it and then we'll move on. So remember, cars is to motorcycle for Korea is 50 is to 25, which is the same as if you simplify this, it will be 2 is to 1. Okay, if you divide both sides by 25. And for Germany, is 100 is to 25. When you simplify this by dividing both sides by 25, you get 4 is to 1. Okay, so you're going to have 4 is to 1. Now, here, the opportunity cost of producing one motorcycle in Korea is 2 cars. Okay, 1 is to 2. So the opportunity cost of producing one motorcycle, that's why I made it 1M. So one motorcycle in Korea is 2 cars because one motorcycle is to 2. However, the opportunity cost of producing 1 car in Korea is the inverse. All right. So if one motorcycle is to 2 cars, that means that 1 car will be less. So if less, more divide, right? So is 1/2 or half motorcycle. So the opportunity cost of producing 1 car in Korea is half motorcycle. Now let's look at that for for Germany. So for Germany, the opportunity cost of producing one motorcycle is 4 cars. And that will mean that the opportunity cost of producing 1 car is 1/4 motorcycles. That is for Germany. So this is the opportunity cost, right? Now C says that we should determine the commodity that gives each country a comparative advantage, right? The commodity that gives each country a comparative advantage. So if you look at this, you are going to compare. That's why we use the word comparative advantage. We are going to compare. So for Korea, anytime they produce one motorcycle, it costs them 2 cars. For US, anytime they produce one motorcycle, it costs them 4 cars. All right. So it means that it costs Korea relatively less to produce motorcycle than US, all right? So it means that Korea has comparative advantage in producing motorcycles, all right? Now let's check for car. If Korea produces 1 car, it costs them half motorcycle. And if US produces 1 car, it costs them quarter motorcycle. That means that it costs US relatively less to produce 1 car. So here we can say that no, that's Germany. Sorry, I keep on saying US. Sorry, it is Germany. So it means that Germany has comparative advantage, right? So has comparative advantage in producing cars. Okay, so that is it. We have comparative advantage in producing cars. Now, the next one says that what would be the acceptable term of trade for each country? Acceptable term of trade, okay? Now remember, so we go back here, remember that for Korea, when they produce one motor vehicle, it costs them 2 cars. So Korea will be willing to exchange one motor vehicle for more than 2 cars so that they will benefit. Because if it is 2 cars or less, they are better off producing it themselves. There is no need to exchange. But they'll be willing to exchange when they will get more than 2 cars for one motor vehicle. All right. So for Korea, they want more than 2 cars. Or 2 cars should be less, 2 should be less than the number of cars. Or the number of cars should be more than 2. Okay, either way, so that's how I've written it. 2 should be less than the number of cars, or the number of cars should be more than 2. All right. So that would be an acceptable term of trade for Korea. But what about US? What about US? Now remember, US, when they produce one motor vehicle, it costs them 4 cars. So US will be willing to exchange less than 3 cars, less than 4 cars for one motor vehicle, because if they produce one motor vehicle and it costs them 4 cars, if they are not producing and they are getting it from Korea, they'll be willing to exchange less than 4 cars. Otherwise, they are better off producing it themselves. Okay, so they'll be willing to exchange less than 4 cars. So the number of cars should be less than 4 for US, all right? So that means the number should be between 2 and 4. And obviously, the number will be what? 3. All right, so here, the acceptable term of trade for both parties is one motor vehicle is for 3 cars. Okay, one motor vehicle is for 3 cars. So this is quite simple. That will be the acceptable term of trade because the figure should be between 2 and 4. So it is 3. All right. Now, the question now says that determine the pattern of trade as after specialization. So here, this does not say somebody wants to exchange. It just says determine the pattern of trade after specialization, right? So this has nothing to do with the terms of trade. It has nothing to do with the terms of trade. It says determine the pattern of specialization after trade. So here, remember that Korea will specialize in motor vehicle because they have higher comparative advantage, and US will specialize in cars. Sorry, Germany will specialize in cars. Okay, so we have Korea, and then we have Germany. So cars, and then motorcycles. Now here, Korea is going to specialize in motorcycles. So this number of cars here will flow over to become motorcycle. Remember, 2 cars is to 1 motorcycle, right? 2 cars is to 1 motorcycle. Okay, that means that if you have 25, if you have 50 cars, if it is flowing over to become motorcycle, it will be 25 motorcycle because 2 cars is 1 motorcycle. So it means 25 cars, sorry, 50 cars will become 25 motorcycles. So when it comes to add, you have 50 here. Then, if US is specializing in producing cars, remember that one car, okay, remember that for Germany, I keep on saying US, sorry. Remember for Germany, if this number of motor vehicles here is flowing over to become cars, remember that one motorcycle is 4 cars. So if this one are flowing here, 25 is flowing here, it means that 25 cars is 100. Okay, it means that 25 cars will be 100, 25, sorry, motor vehicles or motorcycle. When it's flowing here, it becomes 100. So we already have 100 existing. So that will make here 200. Okay, and then here will be 0, and here will be 0. So here will be 200, and here will be 50. All right. So that ends the question. If the question now says that they want to do an exchange after specialization, that is when we will employ the term of trade. All right. Okay, so this is the first part of the video on international trade theory. The second part talks about other reasons why companies or why countries should embark on international trade. So please like, comment, share, and most importantly, subscribe to this channel. Thank you.